When you think of World War II, what images flood your mind? The beaches of Normandy stained red with sacrifice, the rubble of Berlin smoking under a blood-red sky, the vast tank battles across the steppes of Russia. But what if I told you there was a front so brutal, so unforgiving, that the very elements became a deadlier enemy than any human army? A place where the thermometer became a weapon of mass destruction, where darkness lasted for 6 months straight, where men didn't fight for glory or territory, they fought simply to see the next dawn. Prepare to discover the forgotten Arctic theater, a frozen hell at the top of the world where survival itself was the ultimate victory. This is the story that history forgot to tell. June 1941. While the world's attention was riveted on the massive mechanized warfare of Central Europe, a specialized nightmare was unfolding 800 miles north of Leningrad in the jagged, hostile shadows of the Arctic Circle. Adolf Hitler had just launched Operation Silver Fox, a surgical strike designed to seize Murmansk, the Soviet Union's only ice-free northern port. This was no mere footnote in the war. This was strategic chess played at the edge of the world. Murmansk was the primary artery through which American and British Lend-Lease aid flowed into the Soviet war machine. Tanks, aircraft, fuel, food, medical supplies, everything Stalin needed to keep fighting poured through this single vulnerable port. If the Nazis could sever this lifeline, the entire Eastern Front could collapse. The Soviet Union would starve. Hitler knew this. Churchill knew this. Stalin knew this. To achieve this objective, Hitler deployed his elite shock troops, the Gebirgsjäger. These weren't ordinary soldiers. These were mountain rangers who had conquered the impossible peaks of the Alps and the treacherous crags of Norway. They arrived with mules specially trained for high-altitude terrain, sophisticated climbing ropes, pitons, ice axes, cold weather gear tested in the Bavarian winters. They were confident. They were prepared. They were tragically, fatally mistaken. The Gebirgsjäger had prepared for mountains. They had studied tactics for alpine warfare, for vertical combat, for siege operations in snow-covered peaks. But they were not prepared for the tundra. This was a prehistoric landscape that didn't just resist war, it resisted life itself. An ocean of granite and moss. No trees for cover. No hills for tactical advantage. No shelter from the wind that screamed across the wasteland at 60 miles per hour, stripping exposed flesh to the bone in minutes. The Germans had trained to climb mountains, but here there were no mountains to climb, only an infinite hostile flatness that offered no quarter and accepted no surrender. You think you understand cold? Think again. Imagine a battlefield where temperatures plummeted to minus 50 degrees Fahrenheit, where a blizzard could bury an entire battalion in 2 hours, where frostbite wasn't a medical emergency, it was just Tuesday. We're about to expose the untold story of the Arctic front, a frozen hell where humanity pushed the absolute limits of survival, where the normal rules of physics seemed to rewrite themselves overnight. The ground itself was solid permafrost, frozen as hard as granite for thousands of feet down. For 10,000 years, this earth had never thawed. Standard military doctrine evaporated the moment boots hit this alien terrain. You couldn't dig foxholes. Shovels shattered. Pickaxes bounced off the iron-hard surface like they were striking an anvil. So the soldiers improvised. They had to build their defenses upward. They scavenged jagged rocks. They hauled timber from the few scraggly trees that existed hundreds of miles south. And when those materials ran out, they used what the battlefield provided. The frozen bodies of fallen comrades and dead horses. They stacked corpses like cordwood, creating breastworks against enemy fire. In the minus 40-degree cold, a body froze solid in minutes. It became as hard as concrete, as impenetrable as sandbags. This wasn't desecration. This was survival. The machinery of modern war fared no better. At minus 40 degrees Celsius, the lubricants that made the German war machine function simply stopped working. Standard engine oil, the lifeblood of tanks and trucks, transformed into thick black glue, completely useless. To start a tank, crews had to light small bonfires directly underneath the chassis for hours, just to thaw the lubricants enough for the engine to turn over. And even then, there was no guarantee it would work. Rifles presented their own nightmare. Every soldier knew a single drop of grease on the firing mechanism meant death. That drop would freeze solid, welding the firing pin in place. Your weapon became nothing more than an expensive club, so they stripped every rifle completely dry and ran them with no lubrication at all, metal grinding on metal. The guns wore out faster, but at least they fired. Even breathing was a hazard. The moisture from a soldier's exhalation would freeze instantly in the air. It would accumulate as ice crystals on eyelashes, on mustaches, on the wool balaclavas they wore for protection. This ice mask would grow thicker with each breath. Men reported waking up unable to breathe, suffocating under the frozen condensation of their own breath. Some some never woke up at all. But the cold, as unbearable as it was only part of the nightmare. What if the deadliest enemy in World War II wasn't an army but the planet itself? For 6 months of the year, from October to March, the sun never rose above the horizon. This was the polar night, an endless, oppressive twilight, not complete darkness. That would almost be easier. Instead, it was a perpetual, eerie half-light that played tricks on the mind and destroyed the soul. The only illumination came from two sources: the ghost-like shimmer of the aurora borealis dancing across the sky in alien greens and purples, and the blinding, terrifying flash of artillery fire splitting the darkness. In this darkness, time lost all meaning. There was no morning, no evening, no cycle to anchor the human mind. Medical officers documented a phenomenon they called Lapland fever, a soul-crushing psychosis born from vitamin D deficiency, isolation, and the fundamental wrongness of living in perpetual night. The symptoms were horrifying. Men began to hallucinate. They reported seeing entire phantom cities rising from the snow, glittering spires and warm lights that would vanish when approached. They heard voices in the wind, calling their names, speaking in the voices of dead friends and family members. Some soldiers became convinced they were already dead, that they had died, and this frozen purgatory was their eternal punishment. Suicide rates soared, not from despair over the war, but from the simple inability of the human mind to process this environment. And then when the darkness finally lifted, it got worse. When April arrived, the midnight sun rose and refused to set. 24 hours of relentless, blinding light. The sun wheeled around the horizon like a predator circling its prey, never dipping below the edge of the world. Sleep became impossible. The human circadian rhythm, evolved over millions of years to follow the day-night cycle, simply collapsed. Men tied rags over their eyes, buried themselves in their tents, but the light found them. Always. The light was inescapable. But the midnight sun brought something even worse than sleeplessness. The ice began to melt. The permafrost, frozen solid for 10 millennia, began to thaw. But it didn't thaw evenly. It couldn't. The ground beneath remained frozen, impermeable. So the meltwater had nowhere to go. The entire Arctic front transformed into a vast, bottomless, mosquito-infested swamp. Millions of square miles of freezing mud that could swallow a man whole. The elite German mountain troops, men who had scaled vertical ice walls in the Alps, found themselves wading waist-deep through freezing muck. Their specialized training meant nothing. Their sophisticated equipment was useless. They were reduced to the same miserable state as every other soldier, cold, wet, exhausted, and fighting an enemy that could not be shot, bombed, or negotiated with. And then came the mosquitoes. Arctic mosquitoes don't just bite. They attack in biblical swarms. Clouds of insects so dense they blackened the air. The buzzing was so loud it drowned out conversation. Soldiers reported that the mosquitoes would crawl into any opening. Ears, nose, mouth, eyes. Men would wake up with their faces swollen beyond recognition. The pack animals had it worst of all. Horses and mules, already weakened by cold and starvation, were driven to complete madness by the insects. They would run blindly into minefields or off cliffs, desperate to escape the swarms. Thousands died this way, not from bullets, from mosquitoes. Discover the ingenious and desperate strategies employed by both sides in this brutal fight for survival. As German trucks and horses died by the thousands, their frozen corpses littering the tundra like monuments to hubris, the Soviets turned to a source of ancient wisdom. They asked the indigenous Sami people who had survived in this landscape for thousands of years, "How do you live here? How do you move? How do you win?" The answer was simple, elegant, brilliant: reindeer. The Red Army formed reindeer transport battalions. Over 6,000 reindeer were mobilized, pressed into service as the engines of the North. Think about the genius of this solution. Reindeer didn't need gasoline, which froze and became useless. They could forage for lichen beneath the snow, finding sustenance where German horses starved. They were silent, ghosting through the darkness where trucks announced their presence for miles. Their hooves were naturally designed for the tundra, wide, splayed, perfect for walking on snow and ice. And they could haul sleds laden with ammunition, medical supplies, and wounded soldiers through blizzards that would ground any aircraft and immobilize any vehicle. These animals saved tens of thousands of lives. When the shooting stopped and a soldier lay bleeding in the snow, it was often a reindeer sled that meant the difference between life and death. The Germans mocked this at first. "Reindeer," they laughed. "We have panzers. We have the finest military equipment in the world." But their panzers wouldn't start. Their equipment was buried under snow or sinking into the summer mud. Meanwhile, the reindeer kept moving, kept delivering, kept saving lives. Sometimes the old ways are the best ways, but the war in the Arctic wasn't fought only on land. Simultaneously, the naval war in the Barents Sea reached a fever fever pitch of intensity and horror. The Arctic convoys, merchant ships carrying desperately needed supplies from Britain and America to Murmansk, navigated what sailors came to call the suicide run. They had to sail around occupied Norway, through waters infested with German U-boats, surface raiders, and bomber aircraft operating from Norwegian airfields. But the greatest enemy wasn't German, it was ice. Sea spray from the Arctic Ocean would hit the ships and freeze. Instantly, completely. Ice accumulated on every surface. The decks, the railings, the gun turrets, the radio masts. If the sailors did not spend 24 hours a day, every single hour, hacking the ice off with axes and steam hoses, the ships would become top-heavy. And a top-heavy ship in the rolling Arctic swells would do one thing: capsize. Men watched their sister ships roll over and sink in minutes, taking hundreds of sailors down with them. Not from torpedoes, not from bombs, from ice. To fall into the water was a death sentence. The ocean temperature hovered at 34 degrees Fahrenheit, just above freezing. At that temperature, the human body has minutes, maybe 5 if you're lucky. The cold water triggers an involuntary gasping reflex. You inhale water, your heart rate spikes, then crashes. Cardiac arrest follows in less than 2 minutes. Rescue was almost impossible. By the time a ship could maneuver close enough to throw a line, the sailor in the water was already gone, frozen solid, eyes wide open. One survivor described it. The water was so cold it felt like being stabbed with 1,000 knives. Then, nothing, just numbness. I remember thinking, so this is how it ends. This is how I die. Not from the enemy, from the sea itself. Of the 78 Arctic convoys that sailed during the war, 3,000 sailors never came home. The war on the Arctic front didn't end with a decisive, cinematic battle. There was no triumphant charge, no flag raised on a conquered summit. It was a slow, agonizing grind of attrition against the wind. By October 1944, after 3 years of frozen hell, the Soviet Petsamo-Kirkin's offensive finally broke the German lines. But there would be no prisoners, no negotiated retreat. Hitler ordered a complete scorched earth withdrawal across northern Norway. Every building burned, every bridge destroyed, every well poisoned. The Germans left nothing behind but ash and corpses. 70,000 Norwegian civilians were forcibly evacuated ahead of the destruction. Their homes were torched, their churches reduced to rubble. The retreating Germans even destroyed the infrastructure they themselves had built: roads, airfields, communication lines, ensuring that whoever followed would find only wasteland. Today, more than 80 years later, the Arctic is changing. Climate change is melting the permafrost that held this battlefield frozen for nearly a century. And occasionally, the ice yields its secrets. Soldiers perfectly preserved, still clutching their rifles, uniforms intact, colors unfaded, as if they had simply fallen asleep yesterday and might wake at any moment. Letters to loved ones never sent, still readable in their breast pockets. Photographs of wives and children who are now themselves elderly or gone. These frozen ghosts serve as a haunting reminder of a time when the world's superpowers tried to conquer a land that refused to be tamed. The Arctic front remains the ultimate testament to human resilience and human folly, a place where the greatest victory wasn't capturing a strategic hill or destroying an enemy battalion. The greatest victory was simply drawing your next breath in the killing cold, surviving one more hour, one more day, one more step through the frozen hell at the top of the world. Over 100,000 soldiers fought on the Arctic front. Many still lie beneath the ice, waiting for the thaw.